So it's pretty Bamburgh centric, but I thought it'd be interesting because it's medieval, and hopefully we're going to get into some medieval archaeology at places like Pishick, and we also, I suspect, will pick up background scatters of medieval occupation around the area. And Bamburgh's not a bad example. It's just much more dense, much more deeply stratified, and much more fine-switched than most of the rural landscape around it. But it will give you an idea of some of the sort of archaeological features that you can find. It's skewed pretty much towards the sort of early medieval period, which is my particular favourite. But you know, a post hole is a post hole, so I'm hoping it'll be at least interesting to look at some of the material that's been coming up over the last few years. I'll skim past the first bit because I've used these just to illustrate how archaeology can very quickly demonstrate that the conventional version of history is much less subtle than the detail, by just discussing the Anglo Saxon immigration, which everyone has argued for decades about how many Anglo Saxons actually come over to make England English. And now we have these genetic regression studies that suggest very few. The highest density of English genetic markers from the continent from the early medieval period in the whole of the British Isles is about 14%, just near the Wash. And most of Northumberland and the borders here is about as English as Wales in terms of genetics. So it's interesting that our versions of what we think history is and the actual human story that underpins it can be very different. Not the kind of map I suspect people like the BNP are particularly fond of, or extreme nationalists. Right, as I said, this is based on the work we've been doing at Bamburgh. We have a complication at the castle site that we're not going to encounter at Paxton, in that because it's such a famous site, we weren't the first to excavate there. In fact, Brian Hope Taylor dug a series of trial trenches. This is his first ever trial trench. This is Hope Taylor Trial Trench 1 from 1960. He also did another 1A over here. He liked what he saw because he came back from 1970 to 74 and excavated an open area site in two halves. This is area A70. It's actually slightly bigger than our trench, but there's a concrete hard standing and a modern service in the way. So this was his open area excavation. He also did some radial test pitting around the ward. He died before it was written up. So when we arrived at Bamburgh to work there, we knew Hope Taylor had been excavating, but we knew virtually nothing about the work he'd done. So we spoke to him very briefly. We read the few lines he ever published. But basically, we rediscovered his work by doing archaeology. We found his trench with a trial trench. We identified the broad area in which it had been located by finding his spoil heaps in a line along here on an aerial photograph from the late 1970s. It was a bizarre case of excavating an excavation which was only a few decades old. And when we got down to the bottom of it, we actually found fertiliser sacks, bags, old gates, all sorts of stuff. He put the trench to bed in 1974 with the intention of coming back the following year, fallen out with the estate, never returned, and I think it was about 1980 when George, the groundsman, decided that just backfill it, so I think they machined all the soil back into the hole. So we effectively found a half-finished excavation, effectively pre-wrapped. Basically, I'm going to try and talk about the archaeological features rather than the story of Bamburgh itself. So we'll see slides of both of our trenches, Trial Trench 1 here near Oswald's Gate, and of Hope Taylor, and our excavation here in the West Ward. We're effectively at the lower part of the castle, so although we're in the fortress site, and it's all high status, all the really important stuff goes on right at the top of the hill. But the West Ward, because it's just an open piece of grassland, is very accessible. It was accessible for Hope Taylor to dig trenches, and it has been for us. So although we've worked in the inner ward, the real vast body of evidence for archaeology at Bamburgh comes from this lower end of the citadel. This is the bottom end of Hope Taylor Trial Trench 1. I'll just flick back briefly so you can get an idea of where we are. This is Trial Trench 1, and you can see that the blue outline is our trench. This is the trench we are excavating parallel to Hope Taylor's excavation, and whenever we get down to a layer that he left in, we add it to ours. So the idea is to effectively slowly amalgamate the two trenches together, and when we get down to the base of Hope Taylor's trench, which is probably about 6th century AD, the idea is then we can publish that, hopefully get a lottery grant in the next few years, publish that, and then ideally what we'd like to do is dig the sequence right to the bottom so we get a cultural sequence right through the site, which should be a little potted history of sort of Northumberland and the borders occupation. But we are about to see a slide looking this way at this corner of Hope Taylor's trench, which is actually tucked into the corner of our trench, so that the top part of the section's missing. Yes, you can see heading off this way is the trench tarped up of our main area excavation, and this is the base of the Hope Taylor trench. You'll see another slide in a moment that shows you the full depth of it. So as you can see, this is a bit over about 1.5 meters between our trench and the bottom. This brighter coloured material here, right at the base of the sequence, is boulder clay. So that's what's left when the glaciers retreat and leave this scoured rock sticking out at the coastline. And then we get accumulation coming up in layers. You can see some very clear surfaces, lots of stone accumulation. This is interesting in that this is the only bit we encountered it properly in. Hope Taylor left a bulk where a sewer pipe had run through the trench, and he thought it was live, so let it be. We knew by the time we went to re-excavate his trench that it was long defunct, so we actually took it out and we dug this literally about 1 metre bulk of stratigraphy out as a control. It also allowed us to get soil samples, so hopefully we'll publish this trench in the next couple of years as a sort of a preview of what's coming up in our main excavation. But right towards the bottom of the site, we got a mechaned surface of stone cobbles set in a silty matrix, extensive in the bit we were visible, we got down to. But there were 2 cuts to it. It's hard to see, it's all quite dark. There's a curved edge there, and another curved edge there. And what we've got are 2 quite substantial post holes. Now, this cobbled material produced 2 flakes of flint, which Christian kindly looked at and suggested were Neolithic. We also have, from a redeposited context, quite a nice Neolithic arrowhead. So we've got a background, some in situ, some found in their original context, 1 or 2 other bits disturbed, suggesting that the occupation of the site goes deeply back into prehistory. I suspect if we could have picked the right spot on the castle walk and got to the bottom of the sequence, there's every opportunity of finding a little bit of a Mesolithic encampment. It's a beautiful place to sort of sit and view the whole of the landscape. But I suspect to find that we'd have to be quite lucky. We know that there are lots of Mesolithic flint find spots both around the area, and even I think one of them virtually on the drive up to the castle. So we know it's an occupied landscape from, I suppose, as soon as human beings come back into the north. But it does look like from as early as there was a settlement on the castle rock. Above it we get Roman deposits. We've actually found stuck into the section some aluminium tags which were Hope Taylor's finds tags, and they were still legible. So if you want to leave tags that are legible more than a few months, you don't use the modern plastic and marker pens, you write in pencil on aluminium and it seems to last forever. So that was wonderful. So we have some interesting tags, Roman pot, Samian found here. We also found a couple of sherds of Samian ourselves, so we know that both the prehistoric occupation horizons, that the site was occupied throughout the Roman period, not necessarily by Romans or Roman soldiers, but certainly by presumably local chieftains who had their trading relationship with Rome. Above, I think in this section, we found a particularly interesting little tag which had a coin marker. We had stikers, and higher up in the section we had markers for later medieval pennies. This one was a coin of Richard Barelegs. Now, I'm pretty certain it wasn't a king of England or Scotland, so we tried Norway, we tried everywhere we could find. Who on earth was Richard Barelegs? Was he a predecessor of the Normans? And then eventually, from anecdotal evidence, we found out that one of the supervisors of this trial trench for Hope Taylor in 1960 was the great Professor Richard Bailey, formerly head of department at Newcastle, and I think Vice Chancellor of Newcastle before he retired. And the anecdotal story we had, I think from Rosebery Crab, was that he spent the entire summer, regardless of the weather, in shorts. And that his nickname from Hope Taylor was Richard Barelegs. So we had the marker of a coin found by Professor Bailey in his early career. But unfortunately, we'll have to churn through all the notebooks. I have no idea what the coin was. It could have been Roman, it could have been Anglo Saxon. But somewhere in that, presumably in our collection of small finds, there will be a tag marking Richard Barelegs' find. So we've got quite a deeply stratified site which builds up and up and up. I think if we find the right bit of a site like Fishwick, we will get quite a bit of stratigraphy. Obviously, if you've got a settlement which has got functionalities, you know, Fishwick, if you take the name apart, suggests that you're looking at a special kind of emporium or place where fishing is perhaps the products of fishing is collected, distributed, perhaps worked if you're looking at smoking such like. So if you've got a semi-industrial site, we may actually find we get lots of fish bone, we get evidence if there's smoking charcoal structures. It's not impossible, we might find hints of some proper stratigraphy in depth and evidence surviving. I don't think we're going to get 3 metres of it, but as we got here, but it's not impossible. This is the turf, this is the main body of the trench. We've been looking over here where the trench clips the side of our main excavation. This bit here is the full depth of excavation. Now this is shot from high up looking down, so you don't really get a proper idea of the depth of this trench. Originally dug entirely unshored, I hasten to add. That's a whole metre squatting right at the bottom of it there. From the top of the shored area where the turf is, right to the bottom, is about 3 metres, 3 vertical metres. So that's well above the height of this room. So a real depth of stratigraphy, and it builds up over about 4,000 or 5,000 years, particularly over the last couple of thousand years. So quite dense occupation. This is a modern pipe that runs through. So this is Hope Taylor backfill that we've left in situ, propping the pipe up. This is the bulk that Hope Taylor left in that we've excavated out. So that would be later excavated. And on either side of here, we have what was originally just Hope Taylor fill. The hole through the archaeology that Hope Taylor excavated, we took the backfill from. So here, across there, you can see there's a line running at diagonal. That's the line of the block that's left in. So we've got a feature in here. It's all pebbles and stones laid at a compacted surface. You can see it again in the section here. It doesn't continue over there. And it's laid on paving slabs. It's difficult to know what it is. It's about yay wide. It could be a phenomenally heavily constructed path. That seems rather unlikely. What I think it actually is effectively a foundation, a hard standing on which sill beam timber buildings of considerable scale stood. So I think this may well be evidence of a timber building. We need to find where it comes in and hopefully turns in our main excavation. But it's plausible that we're looking at quite a substantial structure there. And again, again, you can see the boulder clay down there. We actually excavated through that to the bedrock. There's only a few inches of it, so it's basically, because you're such a high up part of the landscape, I was looking at being glaciated, and we were looking at a bit of a smear of material. But again, loads of layers and layers of stratigraphy. You can see bits of animal bone, some of our tags. That's a Hope Taylor tag sticking out a section. I think that may be another bent aluminium tag from Hope Taylor. So we're looking at these deeply stratified material, but you can find clear evidence of structure. Again, this is a structural feature. This is back in the original trench we looked at. It may be possible to see there a bit of a curved feature. This is a post setting, but it's a pretty big one. You can see half a metre doesn't get even to the bottom of it. That's a slab of stone, a big chunk of sandstone set on edge within the pit. There's another one at the back of there and 1 or 2 other packing stones, and Hope Taylor's taken the quadrant out of this, because that's the bulk he left in. So we're looking at about a third of a post hole's fill intact. So there would have been originally a big bulk of timber, perhaps a squared off tree trunk, set into a hole in the ground, which must have been probably at least this deep, and big stone packing stones packed around it to make it stand up. So this is evidence again of a pretty substantial timber building. This is around the level that, of Hope Taylor's sort of Anglo-Saxon Viking age. If we extrapolate into our trench, this is probably a little earlier. We're now at the 9th century AD. This is probably 200 mils or so beneath that level. So we may well be looking at a 6th or 7th century timber hall, again probably ancillary kind of structure. You can just about make out there a pebble scatter, so it may be associated with or immediately superseded by a floor surface or laid ground surface. So this is the kind of sort of structural evidence that you find. It's more obvious in medieval and later periods, but it's not impossible that we could find some big structures from an earlier date. They do find these big rectangular Neolithic halls, but they're very rare things. Most of your Bronze Age and Iron Age structures are going to be round houses, and generally not constructed with post settings on this kind of scale. So this is more indicative of medieval construction. This is Trial Trench 1. This is our trench right at the northern end of the castle, but it's quite interesting in that we've got a very nice evidence of an Anglo-Saxon timber hall. We also have within it a robber trench for a stone building with one block of masonry left in situ, but all we're left really is the shadow where the stone wall has been taken away, so it's the hole left where it once lived. But on the outside of it is what we think is the earlier version of the same building, a very narrow slot, about this wide, this deep, runs into the side. It's cut through a mixed, rather reworked boulder clay, which is not in situ as it was left, but it's been dug over a number of times. Turns a right angle, you have to take my word for that, because the wide angle lens seems to sort of skew it somewhat. Comes back across site, there's a huge gable post setting, and then it cuts through bedrock, and that's dolerite, that's volcanic rock, so that's phenomenally hard. But it's a royal centre, and when the king wants a hall, you dig through the bedrock. So that goes back here, turns another right angle. So we've got one complete side and traces of two other sides, one a substantial length and one a tiny little run of a timber hall of broadly Anglo-Saxon date. The fact that there's a gable post setting suggests that that's the post for the roof ridge. Now, you do get fully square Anglo-Saxon buildings, but they're not very common, and most of them seem to be monastic cells. Hartlepool has produced quite a number of them. Most Anglo-Saxon dwellings are two square, as in basically rectangles in which the short wall is pretty much exactly half the length of the long wall. So you get these sort of magic rectangles, known from Greek architecture, but very common in the Anglo-Saxon period. So, if this is our gable post, then this wall here is our short wall. That one is fully exposed, we can measure it, it's 7 metres. So if the short wall is 7 metres, we're looking at a 7 by 7 or possibly a 7 by 14 metre hall. So that's pretty substantial. It would have basically dominated the whole of the gate. You can just see the corner of the steps with Oswald's Gate, which is a little postern gate now, but possibly the original and only entrance to the castle in the Anglo-Saxon period. So at the moment we're assuming that this big timber hall lined on this gate cleft may well be where the gate warden, whose role was to say whether you were allowed in or out of the king's royal palace, actually lived and operated. The interesting thing about this is that although on our site we've got very little in the way of subtle detail, it's a trench through a rather crude stony clay, so it's quite a rough construction trench. But we were very lucky about here. We got one voided area where a piece of timber had rotted in the ground and not been replaced by fill, and right at the base of it we could find some indications of an impression of it. So from the evidence of one timber setting, which was offset on one side of the construction trench, we actually can get a very good idea of how the building was constructed, because there are other sites excavated in much better conditions, both at Yeovering by Hope Taylor and at Cowdrey's Down. This is one of the examples of the reconstructions by Martin Millett, I seem to remember. And those were gravel sand sites, and where timbers had sat in the bottom of construction trenches, you could actually see the impression of the timber pushed into the ground. So they didn't get just the one instance of a preserved timber, they could see the whole run of the lines, and what they got were quite substantial timber bulks, split planks, it's probably about that kind of cross-section, set in the ground, one on one side, opposites, back, opposite, so like almost a zigzag pattern. So they assumed that between those they would have woven withies and then daubed. So if you're looking at the outside of the building as it stood, it would be plank, daub, and it would be almost stripped. So having seen this construction both in Kent and in Northumberland, only kilometres away from a similar period, we're reasonably confident suggesting that this is also one of these split plank, staggered constructed timber halls. So from relatively little evidence with parallels from other sites, you can actually reconstruct the standing structure of a building from a relatively limited hole in the ground. You get a lot more than just the outline of what the floor area of the building was. Of course, if you get really massive foundations, you can also start speculating on upper stories and such like. Though this is almost certainly a single story, straightforward Anglo Saxon hall. This is a good site because it shows you the open area excavation. This is a part of it. This is the part excavated Bamburgh Research Project element, and that's half of Hope Taylor's open area excavation, which is the deeper you got further down from us. So we've got perhaps 6th, 7th century deposits exposed there. This is probably about 11th to 12th century AD. This is basically a rubble spread, which is, again, we assume it's to produce a foundation on which surface standing large timber buildings stood, perhaps sheds or storerooms. Basically, if you get the timber out of the ground and not in contact with the soil, it doesn't rot as quickly. So the whole of the building decays broadly at a similar rate, opposed to having this material in the ground rotting rapidly and the damp rising. So it's just a technique of being more sophisticated than the big post hole we saw before. But obviously, a ground standing building, particularly on a windy exposed site like Bamburgh, has to be internally braced. It has to be a self-supporting structure. So it has to have a certain sophistication of architecture, but it is more economic and will last longer. So this is probably part of a very end of the Anglo-Saxon period, Norman period storeroom. This is underneath a vast midden deposit. The whole of the West Ward was used basically as a refuse dump for several hundred years, up until the castle goes out of use in the 15th century. And just to cap off our exposed whistle-stop trip through time, we've got probably about 1500 years ago at the bottom of there, that's the 20th century. Those two pits here, there's another one of the ladder in just in Hope Taylor's area, are World War I practice latrine pits. Bamburgh, like many major sites, was used as a muster point during the First World War and I think during the Second World War. My great uncle actually had to report to Bamburgh when he signed up in the First World War, and they presumably paraded around. I think he was given a carved model of a Lee Enfield. It wasn't issued with a real rifle until he reached France. They rode around on bicycles and I presume practiced being shouted at by sergeant majors. But they also clearly practiced the day-to-day business of how to dig presumably defensive trenches, or in this instance latrine trenches. We assume they just dug them and then backfilled them straight away rather than used them. But Hope Taylor entered them originally, so if there's anything really horrible in them, then it was someone other than us who had to deal with it. But they also give you little early insights into what you're going to see as you dig down, because we take the backfill out and it's like a little trial trench, but without the guilt that we've dug through complicated archaeology without recording it. Someone else did that for us. So that gives you an idea of how stratigraphy sort of fits together. The top of it, generally speaking, is your later material because it accumulates from the bottom. So what you want to start off with the glaciated rock. People start living there, discarding material. You put buildings up of any description, sand blows in from the beach, hits the building, all drops down. That contributes to the ground rising. All the waste rots down to silt, animal bone gets underfoot, no refuse people taking away, and people just aren't disposing of it. So slowly this site, like a tell site in the Middle East, rises on its own rubbish. And a site like Bamburgh, which is bounded by a rock, If you walk too far, you just fall 30 metres down onto the beach or down into the village. You can't move the settlement. If you want to live on that defensive rock, you just keep occupying it and it builds up and up and up, which is why we end up at the deeper places with 3 to 4 metres. The depth to bedrock at the centre of this trench, we all get to the base, is 4 metres of stratigraphy. So that's the kind of occupation that builds up. And you get a favoured site. I think we'd be surprised just how deep the stratigraphy can become, even in rural sites. If you're looking at a farm settlement that possibly could go back to the Iron Age, it's not impossible we'll encounter this kind of deep stratigraphy. This is one of my favourite features. This is a Hope Taylor slide. This is the opposite area. We've been looking at the big trench there from that side. We're now looking at the wall side, at the other half of the Hope Taylor A70. There's lots and lots of structures, buildings again, foundations, metal surface there, the pebble yard surface, and above it here we've got this strange donut feature, which is, as far as we can tell, a mortar mixer. There's a big post hole being dug through it. You can see another post hole there, and Hope Taylor himself has taken the corner out of it, but you can just about see the cut of this feature. What it is a big dished hole in the ground. Not vast, perhaps about the span of my arms, perhaps a little bit longer. And what it would have had originally is a spigot set into the ground and some paddles and an arm. It's a gingan, effectively. You tie an oxen to it, walks round and round in circles. We've actually got Hope Taylor slides that show the footprints of the animal in a circle around this feature. You put your staked lime, your lumps of stone that you're making, and you mix up mortar. So you put your material in it, the animal walks around, it gets all churned up, you stop, you shovel it into a cart or basket, and you go away and use it. So it's a batch process, but it's for producing mortar, building mortar material on a semi-industrial scale. Now, we have parallels for these. Professor Cramp found them at Jarrow, which was constructed at the end of the 6th century into the 7th century AD. There's a later 9th, 10th century in a secular context in Northampton, and they've seen as far away as the continent and the Low Countries, a broadly similar period. This is in Hope Taylor's stratigraphy. However, just off the side, the side here is our trench, and we're well above this feature. And from the bulks that are left in, we can work out that this must predate where we are now. Now we are on the 9th century, it's quite well dated. We've got several hundred Anglo-Saxon coins from that surface, indications that we may be approaching an area where the mint could have existed. And this mortar feature is slightly beneath that, so it looks as if this is a possibly 8th century mortar mixer AD. Now, we know that the Anglo-Saxons are building in stone in Northumbria in the Tyne Valley. There's a nice arch on Lindisfarne, but North Northumberland, the borders, is quite sparse for stone architecture, and we don't have much in the way of evidence of secular stone architecture in the Anglo-Saxon period. But here we have clear evidence of them producing mortar on a very substantial scale in the Middle Anglo-Saxon period. So one of the reasons why I think we don't see Anglo-Saxon stone masonry this far north is that we just haven't looked at all that many places at the right kind of depth. Bamburgh is a really principal royal centre, but I think they're using masonry on quite a substantial scale. So it's not impossible. I know that the practice recently found what they think may be traces of an Anglo-Saxon stone church under the church at Warkworth. We've got the arch on Lindisfarne. So from being a Tyne Valley tradition, we are actually seeing evidence of stone masonry coming further north. So it would be interesting if we could, to find out, how far this goes, whether it reaches into the borders. But it's starting to look as if we get a degree of stone architecture at Bamburgh, certainly of the principal buildings. We're talking about something more than a hall, because why produce a mortar mix unless you're building on a not insubstantial scale? They're worthwhile when you're building yourself a whole monastic site at Jarrow. If you're going to have them at Bamburgh, you're probably building on a broadly similar scale. So we'd assume the Basilica of St. Peter, the King's Great Hall, were reconstructed in stone. But we have evidence now at Bamburgh that slightly lesser structures may well have been stone. This is the church built by Henry II, rebuilt in the 19th century as a kind of folly. The far end is one of the few bits of fully intact later medieval masonry. Everyone sort of assumed that this was built on its Anglo-Saxon predecessor, much less certain nowadays. We trial trenched in here, having done a resistivity and a radar survey, and at this end on the radar survey we got this domed effect, which we harboured thoughts of a crypt. Turns out the crypt is complete fantasy. It's more of an artefact of the radar inverting itself than any underground vaulted chambers. But it was definitely worthwhile because we did find stone masonry underlying Henry's chapel. There's a little piece of the wall poking out from under the foundations of the 12th century church of St Oswald. It comes into the main body of the church, and this is the trial trench. So we're almost, and that's the centre line for the church. So we've gone from the church, from the edge of the medieval church right into the centre of it. So it's a fair way off east-west. Turns a right angle, massive corner quoin. It's cut into Roman deposits, the construction cut. It's got a 12th century church sitting on top of it. And in the layers that were dumped against it to build up for a floor surface, since robbed away, we found a good selection of animal bone, no pottery whatsoever, but the kind of assemblage you see from the Iron Age right through the early medieval period, where cattle tends to predominate. You get all the animal bones you'd expect, sheep, pig, goats, but cattle tend to be skewed as the dominant species. Again, that's the case here, so it's probably not later medieval in terms of its assemblage. And within this material we found traces of crane bones, and cranes are hunted by great hawks and falcons, so it's the sort of stuff that you find on an aristocratic table because people are going out hawking, bringing their prey back. So the likelihood is that this is an Anglo-Saxon stone hall tucked away in the corner of the inner ward, so unlikely to be either the great basilica where the arm of St Oswald was preserved, or the King's Royal Hall. We expect those to take absolute pride of place right in the centre. So it's starting to look like even sort of ancillary buildings, the bowers, the chambers, scattered around the principal buildings were rebuilt in stone in the Anglo-Saxon period. And having taken out the flower beds, we've now found two phases of medieval masonry perimeter wall that's been moved. Henry II realigned the perimeter and extended it. We've got an earlier, probably early Norman version of that, sitting on a very crude siltstone wall with a degree of mortar bonding. That wall is almost certainly part of an Anglo-Saxon defended perimeter, so we're looking at a stone fortress by the Anglo-Saxon period. In fact, the perimeter wall looks very crude. It's almost like a dry stone wall that's had plaster shoved into the cracks. So it may be quite an early version. We know that Tratton Law has a dry stone wall, so it's not impossible that Bamburgh starts off in this promontory fort tradition. We know it's occupied in the prehistoric period, so the Anglo-Saxons may be continuing a cruder dry stone building technique, converting it into mortar masonry. This is proper mortar masonry construction. The perimeter wall looks a much cruder effort. So again, we're looking at this stone building in vernacular architecture, where we've not really seen it in a part of the UK, we've not seen it before. So again, it holds interesting prospects of what we might find in our more important centres if we get to see them. I'll do a few finds. You're going to get to play with some flint later, so it's useful to see what we can also find. If we're lucky, we might find the odd medieval coin. This is a silver penny. That's the small version, that's blown up. This is a Hope Taylor find, so that's one of his tags. 26th of the 8th. I think that's 11 to that, or 14, that's a context number. C71, so that's area C, so that's Trial Trench C, 1971. Black layer below brown sand, half silver coin. So this is the Hope Taylor records, which we're hoping to incorporate into our write-up, so we will effectively publish his work. When the reason it's cut in half is that it's a halfpenny. It's where the origin of the halfpenny comes from. You take a penny, if you want to spend only half a penny, you chop it in half. You do occasionally see them quartered as well, but they're much rarer. This is a short cross. You can see that there's a cross there which has been chopped through, and then the writing runs around the outside. Later medieval pennies, the cross extends right to the edges to try and limit the amount of clipping that can go on. So that's a later silver penny. Beneath it, these are much earlier. These are 9th century stikers. These are mostly copper, but with a silver content. They start in the end of the 8th century and go through to about 860, 870. The coinage collapses at about the period that the Vikings take over York. That's an Ethelred. You can perhaps make out an E, an A there, E. So that's you get both a Munir and you get a couple of kings of Northumbria called Ethelred. So you need to look at both sides. They tend to have a Munir and a king, or bishop Munir, or bishop and king. So that they do vary. They're tiny, as you can see, they're absolutely tiny little things. They'd fit right on the end of your finger. Because it's a royal centre, we're getting lots of them. And we've recently found a hoard in the last couple of years, which again, this is the coin hoard as found in Trench 3. There is Elizabeth Pirrie, who was the Stiker expert from Northumbria, died unfortunately a few years ago. She was always of the impression that there may well be a mint at Bamburgh. This is the coin hoard we found amongst a metal-rich area of Trench 3. You can just about make out hints of circular bits and bobs sticking out here. It's basically a matted mass of charcoal and fibrous material with coins embedded within it. We think it's actually a little hoard of coins in a container that's rotted and been compressed in the ground. X-rayed, you can actually count the coins. You may have to take my word for it or walk up and have a look at the screen, but you can just about make out the writing on some of them, which are singular. This is one block of it. You can see that the fibrous materials are still showing vaguely in the X-ray. The count at the moment, I think, is 77. But around this area, for the whole of that season, we were finding individual coins on couples. So I think it's a hoard that's been scattered a bit. It does seem to sit inside a building. We're going to have to analyse whether this crude timber structure, the shed, is where they're working metal. It may be that the building and these metal finds that have been coming from there are broadly contemporary. One of the best bits of archaeology, I think, is when you get a sort of insight into an individual, into an actual human life. And although we can reconstruct buildings in which people lived, and that's quite a personal thing, you can find all sorts of evidence of their daily lives. When you find something which is a very individual and personal possession, it is quite an intimate way of connecting with the past. This is one of my favourite finds. It's half of a jet crucifix, so it could well be Whitby jet. You can see, can you see the head? There's a crown of thorns, arm and fingers heading off in two directions. Obviously the main body is snapped off. This is obviously a personal possession. On the opposite side, it just has a single line sized into it, and it's sharp as the day it was made. It's beautifully preserved. On this side, however, you can see it's all rounded off and eroded. And I think that basically this has hung around someone's neck for years and years and years, and they've been touching it, perhaps saying a little prayer to themselves, or it's rubbing on their clothing. So this potentially is quite a prized possession of someone, which I'm sure they were very upset when it broke and eventually discarded into the midden deposits. This is probably about 13th, 14th century in date, in the main body of the ward. But it does put you directly in touch with one individual person. This is a very personal little possession. And so those moments, they're a bit rare in archaeology, but I do love it when you get that sense of immediacy of connecting with the past. Obviously, being a medieval site, you get the full range of materials. This is a lead seal. There's a fleur-de-lis stamped into it there. This is potentially an import that might be Islamic. It's from quite deep in the sequence. It was found cleaning the hotel area. This is a piece of glass that's incised with complex decoration. Again, that could be sort of 7th, 8th century AD. So because it's that era of glass before you get this medieval mass-produced soda glass, which is terrible and barely survives in the ground. This is quite good quality glass and almost certainly an import. Worked bone, this is a little die. My favourite is one which is broken and hollow. which suggests probably a loaded dice. And the fact that it's broken may suggest that whoever was doing it pushed their luck a bit too far. Someone may have stamped on it, found it. Obviously, history does not record the fate of the owner of the particular dice. We have got quite a lot of dice, so that we know that the garrison at Bamburgh were both, they ate well, they probably drank well, and they certainly gambled a lot. This is one of we have the area we're at the moment, the sort of 9th century deposit, is full of iron mongery, mostly knives. We had a short sword, a sort of scrammer axe, but mostly sort of buckles, bits and bobs of iron. This is interesting. There's a rectangular block here. This is unconserved, so all the corrosion accumulation is still attached to it. 2 tangs or prongs, which I think maybe for mounting handles. What we think this is a spoke shave, which is a little blade with 2 handles, and it's like a draw knife. So again, it may well be there's artisan tools. Hope Taylor found a chippy's axe in Trial Trench 1, not a million miles deeper than where we are now, and famously 2 Anglo Saxon pattern welded swords, which are now on display at the castle. So we're in the area where we're excavating at the moment. It's a very metal rich area. It's producing lots of material from very high status swords down to chippy's tools. So it may be where they're recycling iron. Not necessarily directly manufacturing, but it's possible that swords and other things were manufactured at the site. These are quite high status ones. So I think when we look at medieval sites, expect almost anything, lots of different metal, work bone, certainly iron tools, coins. It's not just the sort of flint and the rare finds that go to prehistoric sites. Very prosaic, in many ways quite boring stuff, pottery, but fascinating for archaeologists. Although everyone gets attracted to the shiny finds, the jet crucifix, the pattern welded sword, of which there's about 4 in the whole of Western Europe, one of the 6 stranded ones that we've got. It's very easy to get attracted to that, but it's the everyday stuff that really tells the story and reconstructs it. Pottery is amazing stuff. Unfortunately, the north of England, the Borders region, is, and all the rest of northern Scotland actually, to be honest, has an annoying habit of being aceramic. There's beautiful pottery produced in the early prehistoric period, but when you get later, you still get some pottery in the Iron Age, but there's an awful tendency for people to use what presumably would be wooden artefacts, wooden bowls and such like. So there was a lack of good quality pottery for lots of periods in the region. When you get into the later medieval period, you start finding it in vast bulk again. So if we do find a medieval site, we will date it by pottery. There will be loads, trust me on this. We'll probably find it in the field walking in real quantities as well. This is unusual. This is Bamburgh ware. This is one of our first clear indications that pottery is in use in the late Anglo-Saxon period. Jenny Vaughan, who's our pottery expert, who has been looking at the pottery types of Bamburgh, and we were in this situation where we just couldn't seem to get beneath this medieval pottery horizon, however deep we dug through our midden deposit. And now it looks as if we've got a new type of pottery. We think it's a Saxo-Norman ware, perhaps sort of 11th, even 10th, 11th, but 11th, 12th century. And that will explain why, when on Lindisfarne, when you excavate there wasn't even 12th century pottery. At Bamburgh, we're probably looking at 2 centuries earlier of pottery production. So it would be fascinating if we could find that this stuff extends to the borders. Some sherds, I think, came up at Embleton during the excavation there for the housing estate. But I think Jenny would be fascinated to see if we get a good pottery assemblage from here, from this area, to see just how far this Saxo-Norman tradition in the north here actually operates. There is something vaguely similar in Newcastle called Dog Bank ware. Not similar in style, but similar in date. So we shall see what the Tweed Valley has to say.
How old is the Coldingham ware?
Good question.
Is that roughly contemporaneous?
No, isn't it earlier? Isn't that the monastic period?
Yes,
I think that's probably Middle Saxon. That'd be equivalent.
Alcock's excavation.
Yeah, it'll be broadly equivalent, slightly later to Clive's pottery in Millfield.
Oh right, all right.
Whereas this is right at the end of the sequence where we think what we thought was horrendously aceramic. Now suddenly, when we thought we were in the sort of 12th, 13th century, now it looks like we've been 100 years earlier, which explains why we sort of dropped into the 9th century all of a sudden. But it'll all come out in the wash. So we've got the everyday artefacts, the pottery, which tells us, because you can change it all the time, it's very good for dating evidence. Even the smallest material. When we get back onto site, when the ground is no longer frozen or vast amounts of water is no longer dropping from the sky, we'll, as well as excavating the features in terms of getting their shape and form, we'll be taking soil samples. So we can wet sieve, and this is the kind of thing we'll be looking for. If you're lucky and you get, because most houses will have a fire, or cooking involves a fire, so we do get, when people are using grains processing material, the chance of getting some of it carbonised so it doesn't rot away. It's turned mostly to charcoal. This is wheat, red wheat, 3 grains of it here. This is from some samples, again, from Bamburgh, but it gives you the idea of what you can get. We've got wheat, oats and barley, so we know that they're consuming your everyday staple cereal products, and these are weeds from the vicinity. So not only can our soil samples produce the sort of cereal and sort of bread, plant products that people are eating, you can also see something of what the kind of landscape, whether it's grassland, scrubland, wasteland, cultivated land. A good set of samples will help us reconstruct not just the diet, the vegetable diet, but also the landscape. At Bamburgh we have 100 weights of animal bone, because the beat sand is nicely pH neutral, gets blown in and it sort of neutralises the soil. So we get an isolated island of good bone preservation. We have a cemetery which also has good human bone preservation, but it's because we're in that narrow corridor next to the beach. And you go even as far as the village, beyond the village, suddenly the animal bone disappears on these clay sites. It just gets eaten up by the acid soil. I don't know if we'll be lucky, but depending on how the subsoils vary, whether we find animal bone in any quantity. But if we do, we'll, again, if you've got animal bone, you can reconstruct the other half of the diet, which is the meat element to go with the sort of plant remains. So hopefully we'll be identifying not just the sites, the buildings in which people live, but also be able to reconstruct something of the local economy and the diet, so in terms of farming and subsistence. And finally, I always like to finish with some pretty pictures on a lecture. We had Meet the Ancestors a few years ago, like 2001, so a fair few years ago now, a decade coming up. And obviously they did a fly-around model reconstructing the castle site. So when we do all of our work out in the field, hopefully we'll get some structures. We'll have to see if we can get someone with a bit of artistic skill to do a reconstruction. I think it paints 1,000 words. This is an early version. The castle today obviously is cut off by a big dune field, but that dune field is very modern. In the medieval period, the sea would have washed straight up against the base of the rock. And we've got here, this is supposedly the citadel as it would appear in the age of King Oswald. So a great timber palisade on top of it with a big building poking out. And these last couple of slides just demonstrate that when we find timber structures, what we find is a negative feature, a hole in the ground where people dug to put a timber upright. We don't see the buildings themselves, we certainly don't see them above ground. But we know from the poetry and from chance finds of material that they can be very highly decorated. So this is a version of a royal hall with gold leaf and garish primary colours painted into the gable posts. This is based on I think it's the Nydam ship, where they've got the rare occasions where they've got the actual beak heads of the boats around. So we get an Oseberg, I think, is another one where they've got a cart and lots of beautiful carving. So we know that this sort of Germanic tradition, from all of this sort of northwestern Europe, they produced these remarkable carvings. So it's reasonable to suggest that these high-quality artisans were capable of producing amazing structures, including this is the idea of a royal hall with a long hearth, dais end where the royal family would start, some tapestries hung around, big, high, lofty gabled hall, straight out of Beowulf. But since the helmets and the other elements of it came from Sutton Hoo, archaeology in various royal centres, and we find these great halls, 100 feet long in places, quite massive timber structures, so really quite impressive things. We should, if we're really, really lucky, and we get a nice medieval settlement site, we'll probably find a hall structure, something like this on a slightly smaller, more localised scale, not as great a lord, perhaps a well-to-do farmer. He'd have a pretty decent hall, probably half the size or less, but it's not impossible if we're really lucky. We might find evidence of occupation building and material like that. And that will be enough from me, I think, for the moment.